the Russian propaganda destroyed my family. I mean, imagine your family or closest friends, they talk about one side of the story, and then you have just some random guy on a Russian state TV channel who talks about completely the opposite side of the story. And my question is, who would you believe more? Some random guy or your family? And normally, people would trust their family members. I mean, that's common, right? But we live in such extraordinary time that just a person from TV, he can be so passionate about his ideas or the ideas of his leadership that regular people will believe everything they say. And it does not matter if the facts are right in front of their faces. It does not matter if they're friends or relatives. I mean, basically people who they've spent their entire lives with. They talk about one side of the story. Such easily influenced people will believe just a random guy on TV because of how passionate he speaks, the guy who they never met in their lives. And this is what is called propaganda. And it can be strong. Trust me, it can be extremely strong. And besides creating the hatred towards the enemy, which is the most likely the original goal of it, it can also divide and destroy families. Just like unfortunately it did with mine. What's up, investors, it's the Russian dude, and this is my story. Until 2014, Ukraine was just this friendly neighbor country for Russians. There was no this hatred, and to be honest, even a lot of Russians, they have their relatives living in Ukraine. And by the way, I please ask you to remember this fact, because it will be extremely important later on in the video. And I mean, yeah, sure, there was some harmless stereotypes between Russians and Ukrainians, but nothing more than that. And same story with the Americans. Many Russians honestly want to experience this American dream for themselves, or just travel around the states and see all these familiar places from the movies, or at least some of them were just neutral towards America. But once again, there was no such consuming hatred towards the states. And then 2014 came, the annexation of Crimea. The Russian propaganda took a 180-degree turn, and suddenly everyone around Russia became an enemy. The very first nationalists appeared in Ukraine. Europe suddenly lost all of its family values and morale, and America, well, America became just the epicenter of all this evil, which corrupted its recently friendly countries. And for some reason, Putin decided that this is his sacred responsibility to cleanse the world from this evil of the West by doing more evil. I mean, how can you just erase these so-called Nazis by taking away the territories of their countries and eliminating civilians? I will simply never understand this. And what is even more mind-blowing is the people who believe this. But it gets even more complicated and painful to comprehend when the people you already know, especially your closest relatives and friends, start believing this nonsense as well. I've been traveling around Europe or even to the US with my family even before, way before 2014, and has never been a problem. But suddenly, since 2014, every single time I came back from such trips, it caused some problems with some of my relatives. And the main basically concept they had with me going to these countries is, why are you even visiting these countries? Are you a traitor of Russia? Don't you like your own country? I mean, just take a moment to understand how ridiculous it sounds. How me going to, for example, Bulgaria makes me the traitor and hater of Russia. I don't think I will ever find the answer to this question, but if you want, just let me know in the comments what do you think. And while you're doing this, if you can also feel free to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you like this style of more personal videos, in addition to my daily news reporting, which by the way will be back in just a couple of weeks. Thank you so much, and let's continue. And so yes, the more I traveled, the more distant I became from some of these relatives. And for the purpose of not continuing the cycle of hatred, I will not reveal who they are, but in case you wondered, no, these are not my parents. Our family started to grow apart even further, and these are the people I used to spend at least a quarter of my childhood with them together. They used to bring me to my hockey practices. I was playing around with my cousins, waiting for my parents to pick me up. And now, just because of Putin's crazy ideas and even crazier propagandists who brainwash regular people with this nonsense, suddenly I became the traitor of the motherland for them. And it became even worse when I decided to go to America to study, and then I received my master's from one of universities in Florida. This was literally the turning point for them, the point of no return. All communications were terminated, no texts, no calls, not even the basic texts congratulating me with my birthday, nothing like this. Basically, whatever they were saying, if you like your America so much, why don't you just go and live there? We don't need people like you in our country who destroy it from within with your fake principles. And unfortunately, this has been the way they see me since then. I don't think it changed much, and by the way, very interesting fact, the head of the household is a partially Ukrainian himself, and their last name is basically a derivative from one of Ukrainian regions, but no, if Putin says Ukrainians are bad, so this is true. And so yes, every single time we ended up still meeting together in real life, such as, for example, at a birthday of a common friend, okay? So I always try to talk to them, and not about like, why do you hate me? I was just making the very basic small talk, so how you doing, what's new, how's work, and things like this. And I mean, sure, they replied to me, but still you were able to feel that they want to do nothing with me, and this is even before the war started, so I don't think they know about the existence of my YouTube channel, because if they do, I can only imagine what's going to happen. And so yes, as you can imagine, this is extremely sad, but at least it's tolerable, because I understand that they live under this veil of illusion, and sooner or later this veil will disappear, and then they see it for themselves as the reality. Because I still want to resume our relations, I don't just so easily give up on relatives. But unfortunately, what's even more heartbreaking, that sometimes propaganda can get so strong, it even breaks apart parents and kids. You can probably imagine that the people affected the most by the propaganda are usually the older people. They just sit on the couch, watch TV all day long, then they talk with their friends, who basically do the same. And then the effects of propaganda, they double and become twice more effective. Or I mean, at least this is what just the regular, usual Russian retiree is doing. Do you remember the time when I asked you to keep in mind the fact that many Russians, they have relatives in Ukraine? And so, long story short, my very own babushka, she has a son, who is basically my uncle, so he decided to go live in Ukraine and became Ukrainian back in the USSR times. And as you can see, we have a recipe for disaster here. An older woman who is severely affected by propaganda, who hates Ukrainians, and then her very own son, who fell in love with a Ukrainian girl long before all of these events started, and he became a Ukrainian himself. And I have absolutely nothing against my babushka. I love her, she loves me, we regularly talk, but just not about war or any of its consequences. Because at this point, as you can imagine, her mind is fully captured by the Russian propaganda. Instead, we just talk about the regular things what grandparents and grandchildren they usually talk about, and it almost feels like that our relationship is pretty much exactly the same, almost like nothing happened, but it is a completely different story between her and her very own son. Before 2014, everything was as good as you imagine. After 2014, she became very aware of who her son might be. And then, after the invasion of Russia into Ukraine back on February of 2022, suddenly her son became this nationalist who supports his satanistic drug-addicted government headed by Zelensky, the biggest monster. Her very own son, who she has raised and spent the majority of her life with, suddenly became this completely different person in less than 1 year because Putin said so. And if Putin said it, it must be true. My parents tried to do everything possible to bring her mind back. They always do this counter-propaganda every single time they see her. My father even disconnected all the federal channels at home. And every single time she visits us, it's almost like he's controlling what she sees on TV. And they do everything possible to maintain their relationship between her and her son. And luckily, slowly but surely it does work, because to be honest, there was a period in the past when she was not talking to him at all. As ridiculous as it sounds. But now they resumed their at least weekly conversations, and now they finally once again speak like a mother and a child, and not like a Russian and a Ukrainian. Because propaganda, as you can see, is an incredibly strong weapon, and it can destroy families. And in order to fight against it, we need to come down to the very basics, because sometimes the truth isn't the things we already know.